Well, hey there, we're back. So, it's been a couple of weeks. I've actually been away in Greece and Turkey leading a New Testament trip. Looking at all the cities of Paul, looking at the church's Revelation. So, been gone for a few weeks, but we're back now and going to begin a brand new series today looking at Paul's time in prison and really just asking the question, why was Paul in prison? It's probably a question that you don't really think very much about. We know that Paul was in prison. Anyone who's familiar with the New Testament, or certainly Paul's letters, knows that he spent some time in prison. We've got a whole set of letters literally written from prison. We call them the prison epistles: Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians, and some of the pastoral epistles as well are from prison. So Paul clearly spent some time while he was there, spent some time in prison. So it was at least some of his life. And when we look closely at it, we realize that for at least 4 years of Paul's time, he was, in prison. It took up quite a chunk of at least his time in ministry. And from what we can gather from Luke, it was the last few years of his life as well were spent in prison or, within captivity of some kind. So clearly there's some significance around the fact that he was there. And in fact, when you look at Luke's account in Acts, a lot of the book of Acts itself is actually dedicated to Paul's time in prison. It's dedicated to the last couple of years of Paul's life. And when you follow the narrative of Acts, for most of Acts, it's covering a lot of time. It's covering from the time that Jesus, ascends back to heaven. And then it quickly moves through the first couple of decades of the church. So going from Jerusalem out into Judea and out into the rest of the world. And so it's covering large blocks of time, sometimes, 18 months of Paul's time are covered within less than a chapter, for example, or whole years go by from the time where Luke has been telling. So he moves very quickly, and the point of the book of Acts is to tell the story of the foundation of the church, how the church sort of took off from the time of Jesus up until the time that we find Paul in prison. But when you look at the last sort of 6 or 7 chapters of the book of Acts, the whole narrative slows right down. So for the first 20 odd chapters, it's very fast moving, it's covering a lot of ground, whole years are taken out, and really it's just looking at the key anecdotes that really were fundamental to the starting of the church, really the beginning points of the church, and just the really big stories that help to move the narrative forward. But when you get to the last 6 or 7 chapters, it really slows down in detail to focus in on not actually Paul's time in prison. That's really kind of, it's only mentioned in the last literally few verses, in fact, at least of Paul's time in Rome. But so much more of the time is spent in trials and in speeches, and it really goes into a lot of detail about, again, what put Paul in prison in the first place? What was the whole process that sort of led him to be in that situation? So at the very least, the way that Luke tells the story should give us pause that there's something important going on here. At least at the time of Luke's writing that account, there was something important about the lead up to Paul being in prison that at least should give us a moment of pause as to, why was it so important? There's a lot of other things you could focus on. We know Paul was in prison. We could just finish the story with Paul in prison. But why does Luke use so much of that space to tell that particular story? So that's what I want to focus in on. I want to look at the question of why Paul was in prison. What was the lead up to that? And really, what were the reasons for it? Why was Paul there? And what was the significance of prison? Not just for the life of Paul, but really, what was it in the ancient world? What function did prison serve? And you might just default to an answer of prison was a punishment, as we would think about today. But actually, when we look closely at it, we realize it had really nothing to do with punishment itself. There was a different function that prison served. And when we look at it that way, we realize that's actually why Paul was there in the first place. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, okay, let's just look at today, for example. Let's look at the way that prison functions today. If I was to say to you, why would a person be in prison? You would say, well, that's what they've been punished for something. Somebody has done something wrong, and so therefore they're spending a period of time in prison. And that in itself is the punishment. You lock a person away in a cell, within a locked facility, and you keep them there, literally imprisoned for whatever time it has been allocated to them by a judge, which is to serve as a punishment, to take that person out of society, to remove their freedoms from them, as a means of reprimanding them for whatever it is that they've done. So you understand how all of that works. And when you look more closely at it, you realize that the prison as well, it's meant to serve as a form of reform. It's not just about punishing a person, but it's about reforming them. The problem for the person, what brought them there in the first place, is that they have behaved in such a way that is antisocial, that is contrary to the rules of society, that they've acted in a way that makes them a danger to other people in the society. And so what we're trying to do is to remove the threat. Somebody who is a potential harm to the broader group, to the broader society, need to be removed. We need to take them out of the picture so that they can't be a harm or a threat to anybody else. By locking them away, we can keep them under control in that way. But there's a deeper reason for it, at least a hope behind it, which is reform. The idea is that by locking them away, we can hopefully change their behavior, by change the way that they think, maybe change their whole demeanor towards society, so that when they do get their freedom back, so when they do find themselves back in regular society, they won't be that person anymore. They won't act in that way. They won't think in that way that has brought them to be in prison in the first place. So at least that's the intention. That's what we think about when we think about prison. Prison itself is a punishment. And so, we certainly in the Western world, places like Australia, we don't have capital punishments anymore. We don't have the death penalty anymore. That's sort of been done away with back in the 1960s. So the punishment itself or prison itself really is the one punishment we have for various crimes. At least more serious crimes. A lesser crime might be fined or some sort of probation or whatever that might be. But crime itself is dealt with primarily through a form of imprisonment. But it's a very different story when we look at the ancient world. So we're coming back to the life of Paul. Paul spends, we can tell, at least 4 years of his life in prison. So there's 2 years in Caesarea, and then there's a further 2 years in Rome. And so the last period of Paul's life, or certainly the last sort of 6 or 7 chapters of Acts, focused on Paul in prison and in trials. And so we find a long time of his life is spent there. Now, again, if you're not paying attention, you would think, okay, Paul's in prison, or we know that Paul went to prison, so he must have been getting punished for something. And I guess the default assumption would be that he was being punished for preaching the gospel. And in a sense, as we're going to see the story unfold, there is an element of truth in that. Paul was being punished for preaching the gospel, but it wasn't what we might think, that Paul was out preaching the gospel, so the Romans arrested him and they threw him in prison as a punishment for him being a preacher of the gospel. That's not actually what was taking place. Now, we might default to that without any other information. We might assume that because we would think, well, that's the situation that we see today in certain places around the world where it's illegal to be a Christian. You preach the gospel, you're punished by being thrown in prison, and that is your punishment for being a preacher of the gospel. So therefore, it must be how it always has been, and so therefore Paul was in prison for that reason. But actually, again, as we look closely at it, we realize it's in fact really not the case at all. It was related to the fact that Paul was a preacher of the gospel, but the punishment, the imprisonment itself, wasn't in fact the punishment. Now, where am I going with all of this? Well, the fact or prison itself, when we look at it in the ancient world, prison, and really, in fact, for most of human history, wasn't actually a punishment. It wasn't used as a punishment. It was an important part of the punishment process, but it wasn't that, well, you did this thing, and so therefore you're going to spend X amount of time locked away. That's never what it was used for. The world that Paul lived in fact, the world of most of human history, was a world where when you commit a crime, you're punished capitally. You're either given a fine or you're given some sort of capital punishment, and that is your punishment. You're punished on the spot, or you're punished very quickly and very painfully, and sometimes to the point of death. That is going to be your punishment. And prison is a part of the process only in so much as prison is the place that we're going to keep you until such time as we can implement the punishment. So you might have been arrested for a crime, and there might be a delay before we can send you to trial, for example. We know that you're guilty of something or you've been accused of something, and so you're going to go to trial. Well, we need to make sure you don't run away. And so what we're going to do is we're going to lock you in prison. We're going to put you in a place to hold you so that you don't run away, so that you can have your day in court. Or if you have had your day in court, you have been found guilty, it might be that we can't punish you immediately. What we're going to do instead is we're going to lock you in prison. We're going to keep you locked away so that you can't run away and, well, not face the punishment. So prison has always been understood as a place where you are held until such time as you can be punished. In fact, it's only in the last couple of 100 years that the idea of reform, or the idea of using prison as the punishment itself, has really been implemented. It's really kind of quite brand new in the broader context of human history. So for Paul, to begin with, when we see Paul in prison, it wasn't that he was being punished by being put in prison. That was the place where he was being held until such time as he could have his day in court, quite literally, until he could have his day in court, and what is going to eventually become his day in court in Rome. So the prison itself was just where he was being held. So then the question becomes, well, what got him in there in the first place? And why was he there for such a long time? I mean, 4 years is a very, very long time to be just held until he has his day in court. Well, it's probably a story you've never really thought about before. It's a question you've probably never asked before. But when you look at it very more closely, certainly in the context of Paul's life and in Luke's narrative in Acts, it's actually a very important question because it really does cover a large chunk of the text, and it is one of the most significant aspects of Paul's life is the fact that he was in prison for such a long time. And so what I want to do in this series then is to look at the story of Paul being there. We're going to walk through these last few chapters of Acts and try to sort of unpack the reasoning behind it. Why was he there, and especially why does Luke spend so much time within the narrative? Because as we look closely at it, actually, it's a fascinating story. It really is an interesting sort of part of the overall story of the church, and certainly it's a very important part of Paul's life, which is why Luke spends so much time in it. So again, I want to spend a bit of time looking at that story and sort of break it down over the next couple of weeks and just kind of see what comes of it, see what the significance of that story was. But in order to do that, as with everything I do on this show, we need to go back and look at the historical context of what was going on in Paul's time. What was the story around imprisonment? What was, how did it all function, or how did it work? And so to give a better sense of, or an understanding of, what was going on in the life of Paul. So I guess to begin with, what we need to look at is what, at least in the Roman world, what was crime? Now, again, we could default and think, well, crime is all the things that we consider crime today: stealing, or murder, or rape, or theft, or whatever, the different things that we just sort of default to as our understanding of what crime is, and things that we would be punished for in a modern world. In Paul's time, in the Roman world, it was a different story. The Romans were very much hands-off when it comes to running their empire. I've talked a lot about this, but for the Romans, their idea of empire is very, very, very hands-off. They hold on to things very, very loosely. And really for the Romans, they're most happy for the local authorities and for the local people to deal with their own situations. In fact, for the Romans, in the Roman Empire, there's really only two rules: keep the peace, pay the taxes. That's it. Those are the only two really serious or any sort of offenses you can have against the Romans. Don't pay your taxes, or be some sort of insurrectionist, some sort of troublemaker that threatens the harmony of the society, and that's when we're going to pay attention to you. But apart from that, carry on as you are. And so what that means is what the Romans considered to be crime is anything that threatens the harmony and the running of the empire. That's really it. That's all the Romans are concerned about. They don't care about local problems. They don't care about personal grievances or individual issues between one or two people. They're only concerned about things that directly impact the state. And so that's what they consider to be a crime, and that's when they might intervene. But for the rest of the time, the Romans don't care. There is no police force in the Roman world. In fact, one of the key differences between the ancient world, the Roman world, and today's world is that we have in the modern world, we have the idea of a state prosecutor or district attorneys, depending on where you come from. This is the idea that if I commit a crime against another individual, there is a state apparatus, there is a legal apparatus that can come after me and punish me for that crime. So if I commit a crime or even as far as murder somebody else, that's an issue between two people. And if no one can prosecute, or if it was just between the two of us, then nothing would be done. I've killed that person. There's nothing they can do about it. I've committed a crime, but there's no way that that's going to be prosecuted unless somebody's going to come after me. And so in a modern society, what that would look like would be a state prosecutor. The police would be the sort of on the ground apparatus of that. There would be a legal system of whatever state that I'm part of. They would come after me and they would arrest me and they would charge me and prosecute me for that particular crime. And so the state takes an interest, or it deals with even individual issues like an issue between two people in the society. But again, as we're going to see, that's a new idea. That's something that is only very recent in the context of human history, because when you go back to something like the Roman world, you don't have anything like that. There is no state prosecution. There is no police force to enforce individual laws. In fact, most crimes, individual crimes, are dealt with by the individuals. They're dealt with within the families. And this is the key thing that sort of enables Rome to keep a very sort of low level of bureaucracy. Rome doesn't have a lot of people helping to run that empire. It's a very, very low bureaucracy sort of situation. And in part because the reason for that is they don't punish crime. They don't deal with individual matters between families or various groups. The only time Rome intervenes and gets interested or gets concerned about a crime, again, is something that directly impacts Rome itself. And so what that means is that if you're going to get Rome's attention, you have to do something that is going to threaten the state. So take Jesus, for example. When Jesus is crucified, he's not crucified for offending other Jewish people. He has done that, and certainly that's the reason why he was brought to the Romans in the first place. But if the Jewish authorities have said, oh, this guy's doing stuff that we don't like and he's offending our Jewish sensitivities or he's preaching heresy, Rome doesn't care about that. That's a you problem. Even though he's broken, as far as the Jews are concerned, Jewish law, that's not a Roman concern. They don't care about that. So when they bring Jesus before Pilate, what they charge him with is he's telling the people don't pay taxes and he's an insurrectionist. He's calling himself a king. He's carrying on in a way that is a threat to Caesar. And those are the two key things that Rome cares about, which is keep the peace and pay the taxes. Well, Jesus is violating those two laws. Therefore, Rome, you should intervene and, in this case, crucify him. So for Jesus, that was the reason why he was punished, was because he was presented as a direct threat to Rome. So again, Rome only cares about stuff that is directly related to the running of the empire. And so the highest crime then, the ultimate crime you can commit is treason. And so this treason, in the Latin, it's the word majestas, we get a word majesty from. And it's the highest form of crime that you can commit in the Roman world. Now, the word itself, it goes back to the early days of Rome. Majestas, think about the word majesty. Rome, as far as the Romans are concerned, is a majestic thing. Rome is an incredible thing. Rome is a very powerful and expanding empire. And the reason why it is so large and so successful is because of its majesty, because it's grand, because it's this incredibly powerful, wonderful thing. And its success is the proof of that. Look at how big our empire is becoming. Look at how powerful we are. Look at how incredible we are. That's what makes us who we are. And so if you're a threat to that, if you're a challenge to Rome's majesty, that is treason. You are directly attacking what makes us so great, that's treason. That's the highest form of crime. It's an attack against the state itself, and so therefore you're going to be punished. So maiestas becomes the highest form of crime that you can commit. It is treason. Now, as time goes on and we go from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, it's a whole different story what that's all about. But by the time we get to Jesus and Paul's era, we have an empire that's run by an emperor, by a Caesar. And what has happened, what's changed, is that the idea of treason isn't just against Rome, but it's any sort of attack on the emperor himself. Any sort of threat against the emperor is going to be treated as maiestas, as treason, because the emperor is Rome. Rome is held together by the glory of the emperor, by the majesty of the emperor, by how successful the emperor is going to be directly reflected in the success of Rome. And so then if you want to, if you attack or you undermine or you question in any way the emperor, what you're doing is effectively questioning and trying to undermine Rome overall. And so therefore any attack on the emperor is going to be an attack on Rome. What that means then is that, well, if you speak against him, or if, as the Christians did, refuse to worship him as a god, what you're saying is that I don't want the emperor to succeed, and so therefore I don't want Rome to succeed. Again, the only conclusion we can draw from that is that you've committed treason. So this is the highest form of crime. And crime of any sort in the Roman world is, again, crime against the state. That's all that we're concerned about. And apart from that, any sort of matters that relate to the individuals, that's between you guys. So as an example, if I was to go and murder somebody in somebody else's family, that's a personal issue. That's not a concern of Rome. We don't have a police force. We don't have state prosecutors to deal with that. That's between you guys. Now, you guys can utilize the court systems for that purpose, but we're not going to prosecute you for that. There is a court system in place, but that's something you can only access if you've got the resources to do it. There's no one's going to pay for lawyers. Nobody's going to give you the resources or the funds to be able to access that. So if you don't have the funds, if you don't have the resources for it, then you just need to deal with that yourself. So if I've gone and killed a member of somebody else's family, I've brought shame on that family, I've brought shame on my family, and it would be in the interests of both of our families to deal with that as to mitigate the shame that I've brought. And so I would be brought to a family trial, then maybe involve the other family, and then I would be punished by my own family because of the shame that I've brought on them myself. In fact, this is the main legal apparatus that Rome has, is the head of the family. So the father, or the paterfamilias, or in some cases the materfamilias, the mother of the family, the head of the family, that person is the one to deal with crimes committed within the family. If somebody has broken the law and done something to, against somebody, or stolen something, that's brought shame on the group, and so therefore it's entirely up to me as the head of the family or the organization to deal with that person accordingly. And so in that way, Rome is very happy to give over most of its legal control to the fathers, because they know that in an honor-shame society, if a member of the family commits a crime, then the head of the family is going to deal with that because their honor is at stake. And that's the most important thing. Even more important than the love for a child is the honor of the family. And so if I've done something as a member of the family, and certainly as a child, my father has the prerogative to kill me because, well, I've brought shame on the family. And that's the highest form of crime that I can commit, at least against the family that I'm part of. And so again, then crime itself is generally considered to be a local or a personal issue. And that holds true as well for organizations. You think about trade associations, I've talked a lot about those, but groups that are sort of a formal organization, paid membership, people who are part of that group in sort of a formal capacity, if one of their members acts in a way that brings shame on the group, then again, it's up to the group to deal with that person, to deal with them in a way that is going to bring about, so at least restore the honor of the group, fine them, maybe even remove them from the group. In fact, we talked about this a few weeks ago, but in some cases, in some of those groups, if there is a concern or if there's a matter between two members, let's say one member has stolen from another member or has violated or brought shame on the family of another member, they insist that we deal with this in-house. In fact, there would be rules in some of these organizations that would say if you take a matter of the group to a public court, we will fine you for that. Even if they've committed a crime against another member, if you take that to a public court, we're going to fine you for making it public, because what you've done is you've brought shame on the group. You've done something that is shameful to another member, but by making it public, you've actually embarrassed the whole group. And so we're going to punish you for doing that. Sorry, I've mixed that story up. If I've had a crime committed against me by another member and I take that to court, rather than taking it to the head of the organization, I've embarrassed the group by exposing our dirty laundry. I've shown the world and the society around us that we can't keep our stuff together, that we're internally divided. That's a big deal. And what that's going to result in is that I will be fined for, even though I've had the wrong done against me, I can be fined for making that public in the first place. And so I guess the first key difference that we need to recognize is that there's only really one type of crime against the state in the Roman Empire, and really what that affects is treason or failure to pay tax. Those are the only two things that Rome is going to be concerned with. As to the rest of it, you deal with that yourself. And in an honor-shame society where honor is the greatest asset, or it's the most important thing, the Romans know that you guys are going to deal with this, if only to restore the honor to your group or to your particular family. All right, so that's a really important factor that's going to play into Paul's situation later on. Another key thing to keep in mind, and I said courts are there, but courts are only really concerned with state matters. However, you can utilize the courts if you feel that that is going to be to your benefit. Again, coming back to that situation of murder, let's just say I've murdered somebody, a member of another person's family. That family can take me to court. If they have the resources, if they can afford a lawyer, if they can afford to take the time that would be required to bring me to court, they can do that. There are courts that are there for that purpose. But again, I have to be the one to bring the resources to do that. If I don't have the resources, too bad. Justice will not be served simply because I don't have the resources to go to court. Again, that's the key difference from today, where there is a state prosecution that has public funding in order to bring those cases. And so somebody who's very poor, who's had a crime committed against them, they can still have their day in court. Justice can still be served for that person because there is funding for the guilty party to be taken to court and to be prosecuted and charged in whatever way. Again, that's really new. What you don't get that in the ancient world. So what you get in Paul's time is a situation where only the very elite can ever afford to go to court. Now, as an aside, if you're a lawyer, certainly as a Roman lawyer, you're actually not allowed to charge. You function as a lawyer, but you're expected to do it for free. Now, the reality is that you don't have to do it. If somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, could you serve as a lawyer for me in this particular situation?" I don't have to do anything about that. I can if I want to, but I don't have to. I'm not obligated to serve as your lawyer. And the fact is, I might be too busy to do that anyway, because I do that as a hobby. It's something I do as a part-time thing. I'm not a professional lawyer. I'm not paid to do this. I'm meant to do it for free, but I'm going to pick and choose my time, the way in which, or the times that I'll do that, and the people that I'll represent based on what is going to be in my best interest. So I'm going to take a lot of time out of my life to help you. There has to be something in it for me. There has to be some sort of benefit that comes to me by helping you in this way. Now, you can't pay me. It's illegal for me to charge you an hourly rate or some sort of fee for my services, but what I'm going to expect is some sort of reward. I'm going to expect something in return for my services. I'm going to expect some sort of gift to the back end. You might just sign over to me one of your houses, or you're a very famous elite person that by serving you, by getting you out of these charges, well, I'm going to get the fame that comes along with that. There has to be something in it for me before I take the time out of my life to help you. So the reality is, even though I'm not meant to charge you, I'm still only going to be serving those who are wealthy enough to give me something in return somewhere at the back end of all of this. So again, we're left with this situation where if I'm poor, if I'm low status, I simply don't have the resources to be able to utilize the court systems. It's just not available to me. However, if by some miracle I am able to do that, let's just say I'm a low status person, a poor person, and I have had a crime committed against me, well, I can theoretically take that to court. But even then, I'm going to be faced with a challenge because I'm low status, because I'm poor. So let's just say, for example, some wealthy, high status person has committed a crime against me, has done something, has exploited me, or worse, has murdered somebody in my family. I can take them to court, but what is going to happen is that when I go and stand before the judge, the first thing the judge is going to do is to weigh up our statuses. They're going to look at me, they're going to look at the high status person, and automatically they're going to say, well, the high status person is probably in the right here somehow or other because they're high status. And really, I'm already going to be looked at with some disdain because I've got the audacity to have brought a high status person to court in the first place and potentially ruin their reputation. Sounds crazy, sounds ridiculous, of course, but this is the way that an honor-shame society works. A high-status person, their sole priority is to maintain their status and their dignity, and the rest of sort of this high-status world is going to protect that because they are amongst the elites. The elites sort of take care of themselves. And if anybody presents a threat to that, well, that person is already someone suspicious because they would have the audacity to threaten that in the first place. So if I am in a situation where I'm bringing a high status person to court, already it's working against me. Already the tables are sort of turned against me because of almost the crime that I committed in the first place. So your wealth and your social standing is very, very important when it comes to the court case and certainly to the outcome. It can almost be seen to be a crime for me to bring a person to court in the first place if I'm low status and that person is high status. But there's other factors as well. One of the key ones is Roman citizenship. If a non-citizen brings a Roman citizen to court, already that's working against them because, again, they've got the audacity to challenge a Roman citizen, that a barbarian would have the gall to threaten the dignity of a Roman citizen is in and of itself suspicious at best, a crime at worst. So once again, you have this, the sort of your rank, your status, your citizenship are all working against or for you before the court case even begins. And so again, just because you get your day in court doesn't guarantee an outcome, even if you are clearly have had a crime committed against you, clearly somebody has done something wrong against you. There might be all the witnesses and it might be clear as day. Already there is a level of suspicion if you don't have the same standing as the person against whom you're bringing those charges. But let's just say we've gone through our day in court and I've been found guilty of some sort of crime. Well, then it's time to be punished. And I said at the start, the punishment is not in prison, right? I'm not put in prison for a certain period of time so as to, serve my time, to be punished for whatever it is that I've done. Punishment happens on the spot. And again, there's only really a couple of different punishments that you're going to that you can expect to receive. One is pecuniary, that is you're punished financially, you're given a fine, or you're punished capitally, some sort of physical punishment against your body. That's really all of the options that you have. And so depending on the nature of the crime is going to determine the type of punishment. And in addition to that, dependent on your status, will also depend or determine the level of the punishment. So if you're a slave or if you're a low status person, you can expect in almost every circumstance you're going to receive some sort of capital punishment, whether it be a flogging or beaten with rods or up until the point of crucifixion. You're going to be executed for whatever it is that you've done. If you're a low status person, and certainly if you're a slave, you can almost be guaranteed that whatever you do, you're going to be punished physically. You're going to have some sort of capital punishment against you. And because you're low status, if it comes to the point of death, if you're going to be executed, it's going to be of the worst kind. You're going to be probably crucified. In fact, crucifixion was a punishment designed specifically for slaves. It's the most grotesque and most painful form of execution that's ever been devised. And so it is not worthy of being inflicted on a Roman citizen. Roman citizens are completely exempt from any sort of from ever being crucified. It is a crime, as a punishment designed specifically for slaves, and then as the empire grows, for non-citizens, which is why we see Jesus being crucified, for example, and later on we learn from church history that Paul was executed by being beheaded. Why was that the case? Well, because Paul was a Roman citizen, whereas Jesus wasn't. Think about Peter. Peter was executed by crucifixion, again, because he wasn't a Roman citizen. And so the nature of the punishment will be determined by your citizenship status, by your overall status. And again, if you're low status, you're going to get the highest form of punishment. It's going to be some sort of capital punishment for even the most minor of crimes. But if you're a high status person, you can probably figure out that your punishment is going to be the absolute minimal. If you are clearly guilty of the highest crimes, we have to punish you. We just simply have to do that, particularly if you've committed treason. We have to do something about that, but you're still high status. And so in that case, what we're probably going to do is take you behind closed doors and strangle you to death, or maybe decapitate you. It's going to be quick. It's going to be minimal pain, minimal time. You have to die, but we don't want to do it in a way that's going to disgrace you. Crucifixion is specifically to disgrace the person in the worst possible way on the way to killing them. We don't want to do that to a high status person. We don't want to bring that sort of shame on them or on their family, but we have to punish them. They can't get away with this. And so we're going to make this quick, as quick as possible, and hopefully try to do it in a way that doesn't make it public, or at least everyone knows you've been executed, but they don't see the process. We're not going to add humiliation to the punishment. But for the most part, what we're going to try to do is to get you off with a fine. So for the majority of crimes you might commit, we'll fine you. We've got to give you a slap over the wrist because you've obviously committed a crime, but because you're high status, it's going to be a fine. It's going to be the minimal amount of punishment, again, because we're more concerned about your dignity and the dignity of generally the elite than we are necessarily about punishing you for whatever it is that you've done. We don't want to use you as an exemplar or embarrass you as we would, again, with a low status person. And most importantly, what we're going to do is we're going to do this as quickly as possible. Right, there's not going to be any delay on this. What that means then is that we're going to hold you in a place that is going to serve to keep you here so that we can give you to hold you for whatever time is going to be required before we punish you. Now, in a lot of cases, the punishment will happen pretty much after the trial. It's going to happen straight away. But even in the time from your arrest to the time where you have your day in court, what we're going to be doing is imprisoning you so that you don't run away, so that you do still have to have your day in court. And so that's what prison functions as. It functions as the place where we literally hold you until such time as we can either try you, or then afterwards to punish you. All right, so within that, however, there is a little bit of a sort of literally get out of jail free clause. If you have the resources, you can actually flee into exile. And really, certainly in the cases of the elite, that's actually what we want to happen. Again, if you're low status, we're going to punish you as brutally as we possibly can, use you as a public example for everybody else to realize, don't do what this person did. This is why they put the sign above their heads on when they crucify them. This is what this person is guilty of. Don't do this, otherwise you're going to face this same punishment. So we're going to punish you quickly. We're going to punish you as painfully as we possibly can, or give you the worst possible death to use you as a signpost, an example to everybody else not to do this. But again, if you're elite, it's a different set of circumstances. We're going to say to you, okay, you've been found guilty of this crime. It's high treason, for example. And so the only option is that we have to execute you. We can't let this go. You are actually, you've violated your responsibilities as a citizen. It is the worst form of crime. We're going to punish you. We're going to do it in a way that's not humiliating, but you are going to have to die. And so you've had your day in court, and that's what the verdict has been. What the Romans will then say, what the authorities will then say to that person, again, to an elite, to a wealthy person, they're going to say, look, come back here in a couple of days, and we're going to implement the punishment, right? So we're going to execute you, but it's going to happen in a couple of days. What they're actually hoping for, and what will typically happen, is that person will be able to go home and get their stuff together and then just flee. Just leave the city. And so they're given that opportunity. They're given almost that, look, you're going to have to come back and we're going to implement this thing, but we're going to turn our heads for a minute. And when we turn back around, if you don't happen to be here, we're not going to come after you. So long as you leave Rome, so long as you get out of the city and never come back, we're not going to come after you, because the jurisdiction of Rome, when Rome was just a city, was only pertains to Rome. Rome itself is its own jurisdiction. Outside of that, it's not their concern. They're not an empire yet. So if you flee Rome, or if you flee any of our districts, that's it. So what? Okay, you're gone, don't come back, problem solved, and you go and live in exile for the rest of your life. And so typically, at least for a high status person, when you are found guilty of a capital crime, in most cases, it actually doesn't result in death, because again, what you'll do is you'll grab as much money and as much resources as you possibly can and start a new life somewhere else. Now, that sounds like a really great opportunity, and in a way it is. But on the other hand, in a world where all of your family and your group, your society is the most important thing to you, it still is a form of social death. If you have to start again in a new city as a brand new person, even if you come with some wealth, you've still got to start again. You haven't got your family, you haven't got your networks, your connections, you haven't got your business. You've really got to begin from scratch. That in and of itself is a pretty devastating outcome, but at the very least, you literally keep your head on your shoulders. So you have that opportunity to start again. And so then what happens is that exile becomes kind of the default form of punishment as opposed to being executed, because, well, again, you've run away and the Romans they're not coming after you. The problem has been solved. You're not a threat to the society anymore. You've removed yourself. Everything is okay. Now, that starts to change as Rome gets bigger. Rome becomes an empire that takes over really the whole Mediterranean. And so everything is Roman jurisdiction. Rome is everywhere. It's everything. And so therefore, in those cases, you can run away, you can be found guilty of a crime against Rome, and you've got the resources to run away. But where can you go? Because everything is Rome. And so what then happens is that this type of exile becomes a form of punishment in itself. We recognize the value in just removing you from the society because you're high status, you're given that opportunity. But there's nowhere you can go that's not Rome. So what are we going to do in those circumstances? Well, what we'll do is that we're going to send you to an island. We're going to banish you to some deserted island somewhere, or some island that is, a remote island. You're stranded on that island. And so long as you stay there, we don't really care what you do. Don't come back to the main cities. Don't come back to the mainland. Just stay on that island. We won't bother you when you're there. As long as you don't come back, everything is going to be okay. So this form of punishment becomes almost the standard sort of default for some people, which is why we see later on when you've got John on Patmos. Why was he on that island? Why had he been sent there? Well, because he's committed some sort of crime, some sort of capital crime, presumably preaching Jesus, which as time goes on has become a form of treason because it's saying that the emperor is not God, all of the problems that go along with that. He's then been exiled to an island as a form of punishment. So this is an evolution that takes place, but again, only to make the point that for the ancient societies, there was no sense of using prison as a form of punishment. That was just a place where you're held until either you go to trial or till the time comes for you to be punished. But then when we do come to punish you, that is something we do pretty much straight away. Now, just as a little side note, when this situation really doesn't change until about the 19th century. It's only about 200 years ago, maybe less, where prison starts to be understood as a form of punishment in and of itself. Again, for all time before that, prison was just the place you're held until you go to trial. But that changes, particularly that changes within the West, and it changes particularly within London, within sort of the British Empire. Now, again, what's been happening is that everything is getting punished. Everything is getting whatever the crime is, the lowest sort of crime, it's getting punished capitally. And you get a situation that's happening sort of in the 1700s where London is becoming a much larger city for various sort of economical reasons. More and more people are coming into London. And what is happening is that you've got more people coming into this small city and there's no work for them. There's nothing for them to do there. They're coming in and they're living in the street. They're begging in the street. And in order to feed themselves, they're turning to crime. They're stealing loaves of bread. They're stealing purses. They're stealing whatever they can in order to survive. And in order to try to curb that crime rate, what the authorities are doing is punishing everybody with hangings. Everybody, as we've always done, is punished capitally. And so you get in situations where even children are being hung for something as simple as stealing a loaf of bread. But then people are starting to take a step back and say, hey, this is really bad. We're literally hanging children for stealing a loaf of bread, literally for just trying to survive. What are we doing here? How is this right? We cannot morally stand for this anymore. And so there's an increased push for a reduction in the sorts of things, or a reduction in the sort of punishment, the extremity of the punishment that they're seeing. And so what they begin to do, or what sort of emerges from this, is we're going to punish you capitally, but only for really serious crimes. Things like murder, that's always going to be punished. You're going to be hung for that kind of thing, sure. But for something as like stealing a loaf of bread, you can't get hung for that. That's just crazy. So what we're going to do instead is that we're going to punish you by locking you away for a period of time, take you off the street, and so hopefully teach you a lesson that you will no longer steal bread. That's all good and well. It's a much more humane way to deal with the crime. Problem is that we don't have a prison system. We don't have a system by which you can, be held, and we don't have enough prisons that are large enough to cope with the amount of crime that we're now punishing through imprisonment. Everybody's stealing loaves of bread. There's so many poor people that are committing crimes to survive. But we don't have enough prisons to hold them. We just don't have the space anymore. And so this creates a new problem of overcrowding, prisons that have been overcrowded with these low-level crimes. What are we going to do with all of these people? Well, at the time, what had been happening was that a lot of prisoners are being sold actually to the American colonies. So early 1700s, a lot of the labor that was going there, of course there was slave labor, but another form of labor that was going to the American colonies was prison labor. And so you would have a landowner who would literally buy labor from the British for a very low price, and they would serve their time on a farm, working in a field. Now, that's all good and well up until the American Revolution, when the Americans are saying, we don't want anything else to do with you, Britain, and so now we need a new alternative. And so what that happens in response is they say, well, we've got this country, or this land down south, down in the southern hemisphere, this place called Australia, what comes to be known as Australia. What if we start sending them down there? And so what you get are this prison colony emerging down in Australia, and well, here we are today as sort of a continuation of the history to where we find ourselves. But only to offer that as a side note to say that it's only within that context that prison starts to be seen differently, starts to be used differently. Prison becomes the punishment in and of itself. But again, that wasn't the case for most of human history. So all of this to say, when we're looking at Paul in prison, we're not looking at a guy being punished by being put in prison. What we're dealing with when we come to Paul's life is that we've got a guy who's been held in prison until he has his day in court. And what we're going to look at in the rest of this series is what that day in court was about. Why was it that Paul was going to court in the first place? But for Paul, this is the reason why he was there. Prison itself was the place he was being held. Now, one more just final fact before we sort of before we finish up for today. When you do go to prison, there's no support for you. You're not going to prison and, there's like some, funding for food and for, to take care of your basic needs. If you go to prison, you have to look after yourself. And so prison itself can be a death sentence in that you can be locked away and there's nobody there to look after you. There's no one's feeding you. No one's providing you with the resources to stay there. So you can probably you can often just die of starvation because, well, that's it. You're locked away and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't feed yourself. You're just going to die there in prison. So it in of itself can be a punishment, but only sort of as a secondary consequence of the fact that they don't look after you. So if you do happen to go to prison, it's very, very important that you have people on the outside who are going to take care of your needs. Now, unfortunately, if you've been thrown in prison, it's because you've done something to disgrace your community. Nobody wants anything to do with you, so very often you're not going to have anyone to support you. So if you do happen to be arrested, if you do happen to be imprisoned, you're going to want to hope that you've got somebody there to look after you. And we're going to see later on how that in fact was the case when it came to Paul's situation. All right, so that's a very long background to the situation. But it's important for us to understand that, because when we look at Paul's time, when we look at these last chapters of Acts and the very drawn out experience that Paul has, I mean, these 4 years of being imprisoned, again, we need to recognize that in itself wasn't the punishment. That was just Paul being held until he has his day in court. Now, the question that remains then is, why did Paul need to have a day in court in the first place? What was it that Paul actually did that brought him to that situation of being held in prison or in that custody for the time that he was? Well, that's what we're going to look at in the rest of this series. So join me next week and we'll begin the story looking at the start at Paul's arrest in Jerusalem. So join me for that.